This afternoon I'm going to talk to you about cost-benefit analysis for fire risk reduction measures. This morning I reviewed CCI's risk assessment projects with a focus on fire risk. For most of the institutions we have worked with, fire risk ranks higher extreme. Therefore, we have highly recommended that these risks be reduced in some fashion. This since the effective control level can be increased. In this example, from control level 1, which you see here, to control level 2, simply by installing a fire alarm system and ensuring that fire extinguishers are inspected annually so that they can be counted on to function when they need to. This improvement is not expected to change the frequency of fire incidents, but will reduce the likelihood of total building fires. Paul Borel, a fire expert who worked with Tétreault's work, the work that I talked about this morning to create this control level model, felt that most Canadian museums should be able to achieve fire control level 3. The expected frequency of fires is not much lower than 1 or 2, but the chance of spread to the whole building is very much reduced. A higher level of control level may not be possible if the building is not non-combustible. So if it's a wood frame building, they're not going to get higher than control level 3. We often recommend a suite of such improvements to increase the fire control level of facility. I show an example here from the work that we did with the provincial archives. Upgrades within the existing facilities would help, but could only bring 2 of the storage facilities up to control level 3 and the main building to control level 4, which would bring an extreme fire risk down to a high fire risk, which is a major improvement, but it's still a high risk. To increase the control level further would require a new facility built at considerable cost, but this would provide a significant decrease in risk down into what we call the medium level when it shows green in this diagram. Just as we could help institutions determine whether they are at high or extreme risk by fire by identifying the presence of key risk factors, we can generally recommend risk reduction options that deal with those risk factors without necessarily assessing the fire control level. The factors that make a building particularly vulnerable to fire spread, combustibility, lack of compartmentation, and lack of fire suppression can often be addressed. Improvements at the building level include locating the building away from high-hazard fire zones, such as areas prone to wildland fires, near high-hazard industries, or with high crime rates. Using non-combustible building materials, such as stone or concrete. And separating the building into fire-rated compartments. CCI recommends at least 1-hour fire ratings for collection spaces. The photo shows a good example of a library, the Canadian Library of Parliament, that was saved by compartmentation, namely iron doors that separated the library at the entrance from the rest of our Parliament buildings, and that were closed at the end of every day. The library was the only part of the Canadian Parliament that was saved during a fire in February 1916. The rest was demolished and rebuilt, and the fire started in the rest of the building. That said, even this library is not immune to loss by fire. However, a fire in 1952 in the cupola resulted in significant smoke and water damage to the collection. These options that I've just to decrease fire spread through the building materials and through compartmentation are most easily implemented at the building design stage and thus may not help institutions within heritage buildings as much. Building systems designed for fire protection also lower the risk. At CCI we recommend smoke detection for collection spaces since it tends to detect fires earlier, as well as automatic fire suppression. We've talked about this already. That CCI has gases like nitrogen gas with water mist, so it's reducing the oxygen level at the same time fires, and they can say they can suppress fires with hardly any water damage at all. These can be very great selections for specific purposes, especially for collections of high value where even water damage, you want to reduce that. Finally, fire smoke dampers in HVAC ductwork that close automatically when a fire is detected, when smoke is detected, will help contain the spread of fire and also the spread of smoke in a building, which can contribute to substantial damage to collections. There are fire suppression systems that can be designed for the exterior buildings as well as the interiors. And I should note that many types of fire suppression introduce risks associated with water, but as already been said, these systems put out fires with far less water than is needed by firefighters. In our risk management projects, we have also analyzed in particular the effect of installation of automatic fire suppression on the magnitude of fire risks. So in this graph, we present the reduction in risk for our historic house museum and archives clients if all that is done is the installation of automatic fire suppression system. The effect is modeled using data collected by the U.S. National Fire Protection Association. If the difference in the risk appears small, recall that the magnitude of risk scale is a logarithmic scale, and the size of the reduction looks better when seen on a linear scale graph to illustrate the reduction of risk around 45%. Retrofitting a building with sprinklers or other fire risk reduction measures can be complicated, and it's usually not cheap. New build is even more expensive. So is the reduction of fire risk that we have noted cost effective? To answer this question, I will present the results of a meta-analysis of benefit-cost ratios that Stefan Mikulski of the CCI performed on the results of 4 of the comprehensive risk assessment projects the CCI has completed, using information on roughly 40 risks and 60 risk reduction options for each project. Though this work has been published in Studies in Conservation just in 2018. Before I describe the results in detail, I'm going to introduce the concepts involved. What is effectiveness? Effectiveness is the risk reduction, which is the risk before treatment minus the remaining risk after treatment. And we can show this graphically with a large red risk that is reduced to a small blue risk, so the difference is what is removed. This can be expressed also as the prevented loss of collection value as a % per year, each year. What is cost effectiveness? It is the prevented loss of collection value divided by the cost to implement the option on a cost per year. A slightly different concept is called benefit-cost ratio. This refers to the same ratio, but where we know the benefit in monetary terms. So the dollars of collection loss prevented per dollar spent on the risk reduction option. Mikulski calculated the cost effectiveness and benefit cost ratio using data from CCI's risk management projects, namely the calculated magnitude of risk for each specific risk, as well as the magnitude of risk remaining for at least one risk reduction option for each risk, plus the initial and ongoing costs to implement those options. To calculate benefit cost ratios, he estimated the total value of each collection. He then plotted the results to show the trends on a graph, and I'm going to show you the results for benefit cost ratio. And it's a complex figure, so I will walk you through it, how it works. To begin with, the values are plotted according to the size of the risk addressed by each of the options, following the ABC magnitude of risk scale at the top. I think this will work. Yeah, here. And it's a logarithmic scale, remember that? That categorizes the risks from negligible to catastrophic. And then at the bottom, here, a scale in terms of the fraction of collection loss per year. The vertical scale is the benefit-cost ratio of the options. So it's the dollars saved in collection value per dollar spent on the option. I'm going to place options from 4 of the institutions that we've looked at on this graph. And there you see their icons. I'm going to begin with one of the historic house museums. So there are all the options that we looked at to reduce risks in that museum. If all of these options were equally cost effective, they would sit on a horizontal line like this. In other words, a risk that is 1,000 times smaller than the biggest risk should cost 1,000 times less to fix. But it doesn't work that way. Here is the actual trend line for the data. It's a trend line that has a definitely strong slope, and these are logarithmic scales, remember, so the range here is enormous. It's 1,000,000 to 1 from the top to the bottom. Now let's look at the other projects. Here are the options for the other historic house museum, similar trend. Here's the art gallery, and finally, for the 4 we're looking at, the archives. Note that the slope of the trend lines is remarkably similar and remarkably gigantic, a 10,000,000 to 1 range in cost effectiveness for all 4 institutions. And the lines are not significantly displaced from each other, which means that bigger institutions are not more cost effective, they're just bigger. Let's also categorize the benefit-cost ratio in terms of the return in dollar value of collections saved versus dollars spent on risk reduction projects. Few options are actually truly good. That is, that more collection value is saved than money is spent. Many are only fair and others are poor. But note that all risks assessed at magnitude 10 or higher, our threshold for actively pushing for risk reduction, are at least fair. Think big when making preventive conservation plans, and you will probably be more cost effective than when you think small. But where are the fire risk reduction options? A few options have good benefit-cost ratio. The recommendation to move the art collection out of storage during a major renovation project in that storage, and improvements needed for the archives to increase control level were good. Other fire risk reduction options, adding sprinklers to the historic house museums and improving the overall control level for the art gallery, had at best fair benefit-cost ratio. The cost of each option is high, and the buildings remain vulnerable even after they are implemented, especially the historic houses. Yet these options were amongst the top recommended when we made recommendations for these institutions. So were we in danger of underestimating the importance of cost effectiveness? That question is a common business problem, and it's addressed by a method called optimization. In our risk management reports, we had recommended implementing options that reduce the biggest risks first. But since cost effectiveness was not uniform, maybe a combination of smaller options addressing smaller risks might be more cost effective in total. Stefan Mikulski explored this idea using an optimizing program called Solver that is available as an add-on for Microsoft Excel. The results that I present to you now are also published in the Studies in Conservation paper. To do the optimization exercise, data from a risk project, the values representing the magnitude of risk of each specific risk and the remaining magnitude of risk once an option is implemented, are entered into a spreadsheet along with the cost of implementing the option, both initial costs or capital costs and ongoing operating costs. And these costs are expressed as an annual cost that's spread over 30 years. I will describe the complex figure that illustrates the results of optimization. And this is applied to data for one of the historic house museums that we assessed. This first graph here shows a bar graph of 67 options and the risk they reduce. The size of the risk is shown by the black bars that have been sorted left to right. And note that the fire risk is the first on the left and that it goes off the scale. The green bars show how much the risk is reduced by an option. Again, the fire risk goes off the scale even after reduction. This is a grid where we will show 12 different budgets for the museum. So to begin, this is the everything you ever thought of budget. It pays for all possible options, except there's a few blank spaces. You see them? Those are options that aren't necessary if better options are implemented. This costs $110,000 a year, far beyond this museum's budget. But it's 100% possible risk reduction at 100% of the maximum cost. The graph to the left will capture other smaller budgets, their size relative to this do-everything budget, as well as the total risk reduction as a percentage of the total possible risk reduction. So how about $300 a year? This is more feasible for our museum. Well, it achieves a surprising 19% of total risk reduction with the maximum budget for an amount that is only 0.03% of that maximum budget. So these are very high cost-effective options. Usually means things like spending a few hours to make a decision to do something differently. And there's no labor costs involved. Here is a $1,000 a year budget. These allocations are decided by the software. It looks at possible combinations, tens of thousands of them, before it finds the one combination that gives the most cost effectiveness down to the penny. The interesting thing about this budget is it is exactly the amount spread over 30 years that would fix the roof of this historic house museum, which was another of the top risks for this museum. But the optimizer did not select that option. It found a better combination of smaller options for smaller risks. And the blue arrow points to the cell where that option sits. And this is the first and only time it occurred in this optimization example. $3,000 per year. Now the optimizer fixes the roof and does the 1K that it would do with a $1,000 budget plus $1,000 more things that it can do. $10,000 per year. Note that more can be done, but despite a tripling in the previous budget, the percentage increase in the amount of total additional risk reduced is not so high. So spending more money does not necessarily get you that much more value. Now here, this is the cost of sprinklers minus 1 cent. They can't buy sprinklers yet, so they do a bunch of other stuff. But if we add a penny, sprinklers, and nothing else. At least in the case of this historic house museum, investment in sprinklers delivers a greater total risk reduction than any combination of cheaper options. If we add $300 annually to this sprinkler budget, you get the $300 worth of options plus the sprinklers. And as we increase the budget, the sprinklers stay, and so on, and so on, and so on. And finally, the shape of the full plot demonstrates that once the budget can cover a mix of the best cost effectiveness plus hitting the biggest risk, more money brings rapidly diminishing benefits. Although this is only one case study, it illustrates in a powerful way in which the higher cost of a project, like installation of a fire suppression system, can be justified in terms of risk reduction. The results could also support fundraising efforts. The approach might also be used to justify construction of a new building, or, in contrast, when budgets are tight, the effectiveness of smaller projects to achieve the maximum risk reduction. Fires happen. Cultural heritage is at risk, much like other structures. As in other contexts, the risk can be managed. Options for improving fire protection are available, if sometimes costly or challenging to incorporate into heritage buildings. Risk management shows that the cost and the effort are worth it. Thank you very much.